They didn't understand fear yet. Not the Veldracker Dominion. Not really. They understood threat levels, probabilities, strategic risk matrices that turned entire civilizations into colored charts and acceptable losses. Fear, to them, was a malfunction in analysis. So when the instructor's hull destabilized for a fraction of a second, when gravity misbehaved, when 12 ancestral swords tilted in perfect unison like they had heard an unspoken command, the Dominion response was not panic. It was denial. Stabilize the field, Instructor Veyer ordered sharply. The holographic systems around the hull flickered, recalibrated, and reasserted control. The floating swords returned to their perfect geometrical alignment, as if nothing had happened. As if reality itself had simply corrected a typo. The cadets exhaled in synchronized relief. But Clark didn't move. He was still standing there, hands relaxed at his sides, looking at the swords like they were old friends that had just lied to him. Veyer narrowed his eyes. Explain what just occurred. Clark tilted his head slightly. Your system corrected a deviation. That was not a deviation, Veyer snapped. It was a fluctuation. Same thing, Clark said. A low murmur rippled through the cadets. A few shifted uncomfortably. Dominion training did not tolerate linguistic equivalence between precision terms and human casual speech. Veyer stepped closer now, his voice colder. You are implying causality. Clark shrugged. I'm implying your weapons reacted before your systems admitted they should have reacted. That is impossible. Clark finally looked at him fully. And smiled. That smile again. Not friendly. Not respectful. More like a man watching someone argue with a broken machine that still thinks it's perfect. Yeah, Clark said softly. That's what everyone says right before they realize they're already wrong. A beat passed. Then Veyer gestured sharply. Two cadets moved forward and retrieved the sword Clark had handled. They ran diagnostics immediately, projecting data streams into the air. Everything appeared flawless. Perfect symmetry. Perfect energy retention. Perfect structural harmony. But then, a deviation spike appeared. Just one. Tiny. Almost invisible. A shift in internal stress distribution. A recalibration attempt buried deep in the weapon's adaptive core. The cadet frowned. Instructor, it's adjusting itself. Veyer's antennae stiffened. That is standard adaptive behavior. It's not adapting, the cadet said slowly. It's correcting. Clark exhaled through his nose. Yeah. That's what I said. The instructor turned sharply. You did nothing to the weapon. Clark raised an eyebrow. I held it. That is not interaction sufficient to alter Dominion forging algorithms. Clark nodded. Sure. If you say so. That answer, casual, dismissive, landed worse than defiance. Because it implied something worse than rebellion. It implied irrelevance. Veyer stepped forward until he was within arm's reach of the human. You are attempting to destabilize doctrinal certainty. Clark looked at him like he was tired. No, he said quietly. I'm pointing out that your doctrine assumes your enemy stands still long enough to be measured. Silence. A heavy, grinding silence. Then Veyer snapped his fingers. The hall's central display activated. A battlefield simulation bloomed into existence. Stellar-scale war maps, Dominion fleets, conquered systems glowing in orderly chains of conquest. This is reality, Veyer declared. We impose structure upon chaos. Clark glanced at it. Then looked away. You impose structure on what you already understand, he said. That's not the same thing. A cadet scoffed. And you do better? Clark turned slightly. For starters, he said, we don't assume the weapon is the only thing that matters. That line lingered. Veyer frowned. Explain. Clark pointed at the floating swords. You balance those like the person holding them is static. Like they're a platform, not a system. But combat isn't a ceremony. He stepped closer to the display of weapons. It's a conversation. And you're only listening to your own voice. The cadets looked at each other. uncomfortable now. Because something about what he said didn't sound like arrogance. It sounded like memory. Like experience paid for in something you couldn't measure with Dominion instruments. Vare's voice tightened. You are untrained. You are unarmed. You are statistically irrelevant. Clark nodded once. Probably. Then he added, but I've seen what happens when statistically irrelevant decides to stop being ignored. A flicker passed through the lighting system again. Just a flicker. Not enough to trigger alarms. But enough for Clark to notice. His gaze sharpened. And for the first time, something in his expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. Oh, he whispered. Vare noticed instantly. What is it? Clark didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the swords again. But not the swords in the hall. Something else. Something reflected. Something the Dominion systems were not showing. A delay in the air. A misalignment in space-time calibration so small it shouldn't exist. Clark spoke slowly. You're not the first ones to study these blades, are you? Vare hesitated. That is irrelevant. Clark shook his head. No. That's the most relevant thing I've heard all day. The hall lights dimmed. Just slightly. Like the system was listening now. Clark took a step back. And his voice dropped. You didn't just collect ancient weapons. He looked up at the floating swords. You copied them. A pause. Then, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration ran through the hall. Not mechanical. Not electrical. Something deeper. Like the building itself had remembered something it was supposed to forget. Clark exhaled slowly. And muttered. Yeah, that's what I thought. Vare's voice turned razor-sharp. What are you implying? Clark finally looked at him again. And this time, there was no humor in his expression. Only certainty. I'm implying, he said. You didn't discover balance. He stepped back another half-pace. You inherited it from something that learned it the hard way. The hall's gravitational field flickered again. Longer this time. And somewhere deep beneath the academy, a dormant alert system that had never been activated in Dominion history. Blinked once. Clark noticed it. So did something else. Something not in the room. Something waiting in the dark between calibrated realities. And Clark's final words in part 1 landed like a dropped blade. And I think it just woke up because you touched its weapons. The Academy did not like anomalies. Anomalies meant paperwork. Investigation. Failure in systems that were never supposed to fail. So when Instructor Vare ordered a full diagnostic sweep of the Hall of Ancestral Arms, it was framed as routine discipline. But nothing about it felt routine anymore. The floating swords had been locked into containment fields. Cadets stood in rigid formation. Security drones hovered at every exit point, their optics tracking Clark like he was a known contagion. Clark, for his part, looked bored. Which was somehow worse than if he had looked guilty. You will remain still, Vare ordered. Do not interfere with recalibration procedures. Clark leaned slightly to one side. If your recalibration worked, you wouldn't need me to stand still. A cadet hissed. He is insulting doctrine again. Clark shrugged. I'm not insulting it. I'm observing it. The diagnostic overlay filled the hall. Lines of light crawled over the swords, dissecting them into data, mass distribution, harmonic resonance, energy retention efficiency. Perfect. Still perfect. Still wrong. Because Clark was watching the same data, and seeing something the Dominion systems refused to label. He stepped forward again. Immediately, 2 drones adjusted aim. Don't, Vare warned. Clark stopped, but not because of the warning. Because one of the swords twitched. Barely visible. A fraction of a rotation. Like it had tried to breathe. Clark's eyes narrowed. Yeah. There it is again. Vare followed his gaze. There is nothing. There is, Clark said quietly. You're just not measuring it in the right frame. A cadet laughed nervously. What frame? Physics is universal. Clark finally looked at them. And this time, there was something colder behind his eyes. Not the one you're using. The lights dimmed again. Shorter this time. Sharper. Like something blinking back. Then the central diagnostic system emitted a soft tone. Error. No classification assigned. Vare stiffened. Explain that. The system attempted recalibration. Error repeated. Again. Again. The cadets shifted uneasily. Clark exhaled. You built weapons based on artifacts you don't understand. That's your problem. Vare snapped. They are Dominion-conquered relics. Their origin is irrelevant. Clark nodded slowly. That's what I mean. He stepped closer to the containment field. And despite every drone tracking him, none fired. Not because they were ordered not to, but because their targeting systems hesitated. A delay? A hesitation that shouldn't exist. Clark noticed. Of course he did. You feel that? He asked quietly. No one answered. So he answered for them. Your systems are waiting for permission to react. Vare barked. That is absurd. Clark turned slightly, eyes locked on the floating swords. Then why are they not firing? Silence. A long one. Heavy. Then one of the cadets whispered. Instructor, the drones are reporting conflicting threat signatures. Vare snapped his head. That is impossible. But it wasn't. Because every drone in the hall now displayed the same anomaly. Target classification, undefined. Not hostile. Not friendly. Not neutral. Undefined. That word did something to the room. It broke the comfort of categories. Clark's voice softened. That's the thing about weapons, he said. They only work when they know what they're pointing at. Vare stepped closer, his voice dropping into controlled fury. You are suggesting the Dominion does not understand its own armaments? Clark finally met his gaze. I'm saying your armaments don't understand you. A flicker. The swords vibrated again. Stronger. This time, the containment field actually warped. Just slightly. Enough for a ripple of light distortion to pass across the hall. And then, something answered. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But like a thought forming in the wrong mind. The swords aligned themselves. Not in Dominion formation. Not in display symmetry. But in a pattern that made no architectural sense at all. A spiral. A tightening loop. A structure that looked less like design. And more like anticipation. The cadets froze. Vare stepped back instinctively. Clark whispered, almost to himself. Yeah, you definitely copied them. The air pressure dropped. The room's temperature regulation failed for exactly 0.6 seconds. Then corrected. Too quickly. Like something had noticed it was being watched. Clark slowly turned his head. You ever wonder, he said, why your perfect weapons still feel like they were made for something you haven't fought yet? Vare's voice was tight. We have defeated all known opposition. Clark nodded. That's the problem. A pause. Then, a sound. Not in the room. Not from the systems. But in the space between calibration cycles. Like metal being drawn across a memory. Every sword in the hall rotated at once. Not by command. Not by field control. By agreement. And for the first time, Clark took a full step back. Okay, he muttered. That's new. Vare barked. Contain them. Security drones fired containment beams. But the beams bent. Not deflected. Bent. Like space itself refused to accept their straightness. One beam curved back and struck its emitter. The drone exploded silently. No debris. Just disappearance. A clean absence. The cadets screamed. Finally. Vare shouted orders, but the hall no longer responded cleanly. Systems lagged. Responses delayed. Reality, for lack of a better word, was no longer agreeing with itself. And Clark? Clark looked almost disappointed. I was hoping it wouldn't escalate this fast, he said. Vare snapped. What did you do? Clark looked at him sharply. I didn't do anything. A beat. Then. That's what's worrying me. The spiral of swords tightened again. And somewhere deep beneath the academy, something unsealed itself. Not physically. Not politically. Not even technologically. But conceptually. Like a rule long buried had just been remembered. Clark whispered. Oh no. Vare demanded. Explain. Clark didn't look at him. He was staring at the weapons. At the spiral. At the pattern that didn't belong to Dominion engineering. And finally he said, You didn't find ancient swords. You found the training set. A pause so deep it felt like gravity stopped listening. Then Clark added quieter. And I think whatever used them, just realize you're pretending to be it. The spiral tightened. Not physically in space alone, something worse. It tightened in meaning. As if the Hall of Ancestral Arms had stopped being a room and started becoming a question someone had long ago forgotten how to answer. The Dominion cadets were no longer standing in formation. They were reacting. Some backed away. Some raised weapons. Some simply froze, their instincts caught between training and disbelief. Instructor Vare was still trying to force order into the situation, but his voice now sounded like it was arriving a second too late. Containment protocols. Activate full suppression grid, now! The hall obeyed. For half a second. Then the suppression grid flickered. And failed. A silence followed that was not empty, but occupied. Clark stood in the center of it all, eyes locked on the spiraling swords. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked like a man watching a memory he didn't want returning correctly. That's not a malfunction, he said quietly. Vare snapped. Everything here is a malfunction. Clark shook his head once. No. This is recognition. The swords rotated again. Slower now. Deliberate. Like something was testing how reality responded to intent. And reality was responding. Poorly. The air in the hall rippled. Not like heat distortion. Like pressure from the other side of a thin surface. One of the cadets screamed as her weapon floated out of her grip and aligned itself with the spiral without permission. Another followed. Then another. Until every Dominion armament in the room, every blade, every ceremonial spear, every reconstructed relic, was no longer obeying the Dominion at all. They were obeying the pattern. Vare finally turned fully toward Clark. You will stop this, he ordered, voice breaking through discipline into something raw. You are the variable. Clark actually laughed once. Short. Humorless. I'm the observer, he corrected. There's a difference. The hall lights dimmed again. Longer this time. When they returned, something had changed in the geometry of the room. No one could immediately say what. But everyone felt it. Clark noticed first. Of course he did. You're not just reacting anymore, he whispered. The swords slowed. Hovered. Then all at once. They stopped. Perfect stillness. And in that stillness, the room felt louder than it had ever been. Vare stepped forward cautiously. Status? A cadet checked diagnostics. No system errors, no anomalies, everything is stable. Another added, confused. Containment fields are restored. Relief washed through the hall like a chemical reaction. The Dominion system had corrected itself. Order reasserted. Balance restored. Vare exhaled sharply. As expected. He turned toward Clark with triumph returning to his posture. You see? Your interference created instability. Our systems have corrected it. Clark didn't respond immediately. He was still watching the swords. Still watching the silence. Then he spoke softly. No, he said. Vare frowned. No? Clark pointed. Look closer. The cadets did. At first, nothing appeared wrong. But then, one of the swords shifted. Barely. A fraction of a degree. And then stopped again. Another followed. Then another. Not chaos. Not malfunction. Something worse. Synchronization. Vare's voice tightened. They are stabilizing. Clark nodded slowly. That's one way to say it. The air pressure dropped again. But this time, it wasn't a system failure. It was anticipation. Like something enormous had just leaned closer to listen. Clark finally spoke clearly. You didn't stop it. Vare snapped. We did. Clark shook his head. No, he said. You paused it. A silence fell. A deeper one this time. Then Clark added. Whatever pattern you activated, it doesn't need your systems to run. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. And then, all 12 swords rotated in unison again. But not in spiral. Not in Dominion alignment. Now they formed something new. A frame. A boundary. Like a door outline drawn in midair using weapons instead of walls. And Clark whispered. Yeah, that's definitely a threshold. Vare stepped back to spite himself. Threshold to what? Clark's expression hardened. To whatever made those swords in the first place. The cadets began speaking over each other now. That's not possible. It's just feedback loops. The system is correcting resonance drift. But Clark wasn't listening anymore. He was watching the center of the frame, where space itself had begun to look thinner, like reality was being pressed from both sides. Then it happened. A sound. Not loud. Not physical. More like the concept of a sound being remembered incorrectly. The swords vibrated once. And the frame opened. Not like a door swinging. Like reality deciding there had always been an opening there. Cold air spilled through it. But not temperature cold. Structural cold. The kind that makes systems question their own definitions. And through the opening, something looked back. No body. No clear shape. Just presence organized into intent. The cadets froze again. Even Vare. Because every Dominion sensor in the hall tried to classify it. And every single one failed. Clark whispered. Yeah. A pause. Then, almost tired. You found them. Vare's voice barely worked. Found what? Clark didn't take his eyes off the opening. The reason the swords were unbalanced. The presence on the other side shifted. Not moving. Responding. Like it had heard its own history being spoken aloud. Clark exhaled slowly. And said the words that broke the Dominion understanding of warfare forever. Because they were never meant for you to hold. The opening in reality did not widen. It acknowledged. That was the only way Clark could describe it later, if anyone ever believed him enough to ask. The frame of swords hung in the air like a verdict that had already been passed long before the Dominion discovered language to argue with it. Beyond it, the presence did not step forward. It did not need to. Because the moment it was seen, the hall itself began adjusting around it, as if reality remembered an older instruction set. Instructor Vare's voice cracked through the tension. Seal it! Seal it now! But the systems hesitated. Not malfunctioned. Hesitated. As if waiting for confirmation from a higher authority that no longer existed in their database. Cadets fired containment beams. The beams curved again, but weaker now. Like the rules that bent them were being rewritten mid-action. Clark spoke softly, almost absent-minded. Stop shooting it. Vare snapped. Explain yourself. Clark didn't look away from the frame. You're not attacking it, he said. You're feeding it. A beat. Then one of the cadets shouted. The energy draw is increasing. Another followed, voice breaking. It's using our containment field as input. Silence hit again. Heavier this time. Because the Dominion finally understood something was wrong. Not because it was attacking. But because it was learning from them. The swords in the air began to shift again. Slowly. Deliberately. The frame tightened, not closing, but focusing. Like an eye narrowing. And the presence beyond it moved for the first time in a way that had mass in human perception. Not a step. A correction. Reality bent slightly toward it. Clark exhaled through his teeth. Yeah, that's it. Vare turned on him fully now, panic bleeding through authority. You knew this would happen! Clark finally looked at him. And for the first time, there was something like exhaustion in his expression. No, he said. I didn't know it would happen here. That distinction mattered. It mattered in a way Vare didn't yet have vocabulary for. The hall trembled again. Not physically collapsing. Re-evaluating. The swords in the frame aligned once more, but now they weren't forming a door. They were forming a weapon shape. A massive, impossible construct defined entirely by intent rather than matter. A blade. Not held. Not swung. But declared. The presence behind it pulsed once. And every Dominion system in the hall simultaneously reclassified its threat assessment. Target status, not applicable. That line broke something in the cadets. One dropped their weapon. Another backed into a wall. Vare, however, took one step forward. No entity is beyond classification, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Everything can be measured. Clark shook his head slowly. That's your mistake, he said. You think measurement is control. The blade in the air stabilized. And the presence spoke. Not in words, but in translation. Every mind in the hall received it differently, filtered through their own cognition. To Vare, it sounded like doctrine collapsing. To the cadets, it sounded like silence being judged. To Clark, it sounded like memory. Old. Heavy. Familiar in a way that made his jaw tighten. Then the meaning resolved. Not fully. But enough. You are using our shape wrong. The hall went still. Even the air stopped pretending to move casually. Vare whispered. What did it say? Clark answered quietly. It didn't. A pause. Then he corrected himself. It recognized what you built. The blade beyond the frame rotated slightly. And every Dominion weapon in the hall responded in unison. Not toward the presence. Toward Clark. Vare noticed instantly. Why are they targeting you? Clark didn't move. Because he already understood. They're not targeting me, he said. They're checking me. A beat. Then, the weapon stopped. The presence shifted again. And the translation came back. Wrong instance. Clark closed his eyes briefly. Then opened them. Yeah, he muttered. Figures. Vare demanded. Explain now. Clark finally turned toward him fully. And this time, there was no humor left in him at all. You didn't find ancient swords, he said again. You found calibration tools. A silence so absolute it felt engineered. Clark pointed at the frame. That thing isn't a weapon. He looked at the floating blade shape forming in the air. It's a correction algorithm. Vare's voice broke. Correction of what? Clark's answer landed like a planetary impact. War. The hall shook. Not from explosion. From refusal. Reality itself resisted the concept. The presence beyond the frame expanded slightly. And every Dominion system in the Academy began to fail in a new way. Not breaking. Simplifying. Stripping down unnecessary assumptions. Including the assumption that Dominion civilization was the default state of existence. Vare staggered back. That is impossible. Clark nodded once. Yeah, he said. That's what everyone thought the first time. The blade in the air finally completed its shape. Not fully visible. Not fully present. But defined enough that the hall's sensors began recording something they would later classify as event type, historical intrusion. The presence spoke again. Clearer this time. Not enemy. Not friend. Unfinished. And Clark whispered the last line before everything changed. Oh no, you didn't just wake it up. He looked at Vare. You activated it. The frame of swords began to close. Not sealing the breach, but locking onto the hall itself. And Clark stepped back slowly as he realized the final truth. Whatever the Dominion had copied was now running diagnostics on them. And they had just failed the test.